This video should look through the Our Connected World booklet and explain some of the answers, just in case you've got holes in what you already have. These are the I can statements. A good thing to do during your revision is to go through these and see if you can define what is meant by a biome, for example. If you can, great. Look at the homework questions that we've also attached onto Google Classroom and make sure that if you think you can define what they meant by the word biome, that you actually can. And you can work through these. This should cover everything that is in the test. On the first page, we look at biomes. So our learning intention would be to understand what a biome is and what makes them distinct from one another, so how they differ. So biomes are a region of the world which shares common animals, plants, flora, and environmental factors. So in essence, if I say desert, you automatically picture a specific like landscape. It's maybe sandy, it might be hot, it might be warm. Every time I talk about deserts, someone points out that there are cold deserts. So desert doesn't actually necessarily talk about a particular temperature. It's more about rainfall. But when I say desert, you get a picture of specific animals, maybe camels, specific plants, cacti and things, and maybe reptiles and spiders, and some environmental climate factors. That's what makes a biome a biome. Oceans have specific environmental factors. It's wet, it's probably quite cold, although not necessarily, and you might think of particular animals and plants that live there. These are the biomes of the world. You can see that actually, depending on what part of the world you're in, you're more likely to have one biome than another. So at the top and the bottom, the Arctic, Antarctic, tend to have quite cold, icy biomes, moving towards the middle with temperates, and then to your Mediterranean and to your tropical regions in the centre. In terms of ecosystems, if we understand what is meant by these terms, we have habitat, population, community, and ecosystem. So we kind of work up in terms of grand scale with these terms. So a habitat is just the place an organism lives. If you think of a squirrel living in a tree, think of a badger living in a set. If you think of a dolphin living in a particular cove around an island region, that would be its habitat. The population is all of the individuals of one species. So we have the human population because humans are all one species. We have the population of daisies. We have the population of one particular species. If you take all the populations in a particular area and you group them together, so all of the living things around Kinross High School, for example, we have the humans, we have the plants, we have the fungi and bacteria, we have everything alive, all these populations, that is the community. So all of the organisms of every species living in one place. Here it's talking about places because the word we're trying to avoid is ecosystem. So all of the organisms living in a particular place, as well as all the climate factors. We're looking at the abiotic ones that we'll come on to later in this booklet. So the rainfall, temperature, salinity, moisture, all that kind of stuff. So the living and non-living parts of an area. When we look at these biotic factors, so we have living factors and we have non-living factors. But factors is something that people tend to find quite a tricky concept. If you imagine you've got an ecosystem and it has 5 badgers living in it, you have to think, well, why are there 5 badgers living in it? So why are there so few badgers and why is it only badgers? So there'll be things that are alive that affect the fact that there's badgers living there and there's only 5 of them, and there's things that will be not alive that will affect that as well. So it might be that if you have more than 5 badgers, that disease spreads really quickly. So disease is caused by a living thing. It's caused by pathogens, little microbes. So disease is a living factor because it's caused by a living thing and it affects how many organisms and what type of organisms can live in an area. Competition, again, if you have too many badgers living in that particular set, they might compete for food. There might not be enough food, which we'll come on to as another biotic factor. So they will compete. So really, you can only manage to sustain 5 badgers in that area. So they will compete. Competition is caused by other badgers. Badgers are alive, so that is a living factor. Grazing. So if you are a piece of grass in a field, if there is 1,000 cows eating you, you might not be able to sustain a very high grass population. Whereas if there's only 1 cow eating in that field, and it doesn't get around to your patch very often, then the grazing intensity is quite low. So grazing is, in essence, how often your particular patch of flowers is eaten. So if it's very high, that will affect the types of organisms, so only very hardy organisms will be able to live there. And if it's very low, maybe only the dominant plants will be able to grow because they'll shield the light out from others. So because the things that are eating you are alive, that is a biotic factor. So the thing causing this thing is alive. Predation, again, predators are alive if you have lots and lots of foxes or lots of wolves or lots of other predators in the area. That will affect the number of rabbits, the type of organisms that can live there, and lots of other stuff. So if the thing that's causing the factor is alive and limiting what species can live there and how many, then it's a biotic factor. Tree is not a biotic factor because tree is just a word. It doesn't affect the number of individuals that can live in an area. People always just name random living things, and that's not what a biotic factor is. A non-living, what we call abiotic factor, so biotic, a living, abiotic, not living. Rainfall, so rain is not alive. Doesn't matter how closely you look into rain, it is just water and some other stuff. So, however, even though rain is not alive, if you get 1,000 litres of water falling in your particular little garden area every day, that's an awful lot of rain. That will wash away a lot of plants that live there. It will drown a lot of animals that live there. High rainfall affects what can live in that area. Even though rain is not alive, it's a factor, so we call it an abiotic or non-living factor. Again, temperature. We talked about deserts, very hot areas of the planet. Only some species can manage to survive there. Very cold areas, only some species can be able to live there. So because temperature is not alive, it's abiotic, but it does affect what's called the distribution. So how many and kind of what kind of organisms that can live there. Wind speed, so again, if it's very windy, some organisms might not be able to live there. If it's not windy, some organisms might not be able to live there due to things like spreading pollen. Light intensity, if it's very dark, a lot of plants won't be able to live there. If it's too bright, a lot of plants won't be able to live there, and a lot of animals won't be able to live there. So here's our definition. A biotic factor is a living factor, something caused by a living thing that impacts on biodiversity and the spread of different organisms. So in our definition down here, we talk about grazing, consumption of plant material. When grazing intensity is too high, you get fewer plants able to live there. However, when it's too low, only the dominant species can live there. So again, you get a low biodiversity. So you kind of want a middle level of grazing. A few cows, but not too many. Sampling biotic factors. So again, if you go into a big field and you say, well, I wonder how many rabbits are here, or I wonder how many poppies are here. If you put what's called a quadrat down, so this is just a square that's separated into different boxes, if you're looking for something that moves, it's unlikely to, of its own volition, come into your quadrat and just sit there for you to count it. So we tend not to use a quadrat, these squares, for things that move around a lot. It's used to sample plants or very, very slow-moving organisms. For example, barnacles that don't really move off rocks. When we use a quadrat, it's important that we throw it randomly so you don't choose a really interesting area to put your quadrat down, and that allows us to get a very representative sample of an area. You should only count plants that are in more than half of a square. There's different ways to count quadrats. Your teachers will have talked you through them, but in general, you have to throw them randomly. That's the important thing, and only use them on slow-moving or not moving things. Pitfall trap is a hole in the ground with a lid on it, essentially. A pitfall trap is used to sample things that move but can't fly. If you try and sample something that flies, it just flies out of your pitfall trap. The lid is used there to stop predators like spiders coming in and eating the things that you've caught. You have to make sure you check your pitfall trap quite often, or it's not really fair. You'll end up getting a big fall of rain, and your little beasties will drown. So this is just a little slide. You can pause the video if you want. It talks through basically what's on the previous slide. In terms of food webs, so we have green plants, which are called producers, at the start of your food web. So what you'll notice is that we've got an arrow going from our producer to what's called the primary consumer, the first thing that eats that producer. And the arrow is going from the producer to the primary consumer. All primary consumers are herbivores because the thing before them in the food chain is a plant and they eat plants. I suppose some primary consumers may be what we call omnivores, so they may eat plants, but they may also eat animals as well. So that's what all basically. These arrows show the movement of energy through an ecosystem. So if we have 100 joules of energy here, a certain amount of that, 10 joules or so, will move on to the next level, and then a tenth will move on, a tenth will move on. So we can see we've got producers, consumers, and then we can move up from primary, secondary to tertiary consumers. We also in this diagram show predators and prey. So the blue tick here is the secondary consumer because it hunts and eats this primary consumer here. So it is the predator of this caterpillar here. But it itself is the prey of a larger animal, a hawk. So we can see it's the predator of the caterpillar, but the prey of the hawk. And we can see here, this hawk only eats blue tits and other animals. It doesn't eat any plants, so we call it a carnivore, carne meaning meat. Omnivore means it eats animal and plant material, and herbivore only eating plants. So we can conduct what are called food webs. So these are more complicated energy relationships. You can choose any one line and make a food chain out of a food web. So you can go sunflower, great tit, hawk. That would be a food chain because we're following one line in a straight line, not going backwards on any arrows. Or grass, rabbit, fox, grass, rabbit, hawk. If you only used a food chain, you would miss a lot of the nuance and detail about this ecosystem. So this shows all of the energy from the sunflower, that some of it goes to the great tit, some of it goes to the blue tit. Of that energy, some of it goes to the hawk, and all of it goes to the hawk actually. So it's a more complicated feeding relationship. You should be able to describe for the test what happens if you remove an organism from the ecosystem. At an S3 level, we only need to do one level of this. So if we remove a rabbit, and we're asked what that does to the number of foxes. So if you remove rabbits from the ecosystem, it means that the grass is no longer getting predated by that rabbit, so grass numbers will go up. More grass plants will survive, basically. Whereas foxes, their numbers will go down because their only food source has been decreased, so there'll be less food for the foxes, so fewer of them will survive. So you only need to go one level. Quite often in a food chain, it balances itself. You don't need to be able to do that. And this basically just shows what I've just talked about. If caterpillars are removed, what happens? And it explains what would happen to their predators and what happens to their prey. In terms of impact on biodiversity, these are a few things, natural effects. We'll talk about human effects in a second. These are the natural factors that affect biodiversity. So flooding, a lot of water can destroy habitats, wash away small plants and animals. It can contaminate water in terms of feces, fecal fertilizers, chemicals, other things that can get into habitats, and that can cause damage as well. It can provide much needed water for plants. There's some areas of the world where it's very dry a lot of the year, and plants rely on the occasional little bit of monsoons and flooding. So we can have wind, so that can damage trees, it can damage animals, it can damage other plants, and over the long term it shapes the environments and the plants that can live there. This is an abiotic factor. All of these are really. Earthquakes are quite disruptive. They destroy habitats, kill animals, uproot trees. But they can also, as with wind, they can cause changes to an environment over time. Forest fires destroy habitats, harming animals and making land areas less hospitable to new plants. Some seeds need the heat from forest fires to germinate and to grow, and forest fires are important in a lot of ecosystems as a natural way to clear away old trees and other plants and allow new growth to come through. Human effects, so there's some things that happen naturally, and there's some things that we are unfortunately responsible for. So with our increased use of land, with the fact that we need to grow more crops, with us digging up fossil fuels and burning them, contaminating things, producing pollution, we have a lot of negative as well as some positive impacts on the environment. So you can read through these by pausing the video. One of the things that we are often slated for causing is an increase in climate change. So the climate naturally changes over time, but we are accelerating that process. Some people get confused between weather and climate. Weather is the day-to-day conditions, whereas climate is a more long-term pattern for that area. So climate change can be measured by things like temperature, rainfall, wind speed, ice melt, sea levels, lots of things like this. The main gases that we worry about in terms of greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, which we get from burning fossil fuels, methane, which comes from energy production, as well as from the decomposition of the kind of decaying and rotting of biological matter, and nitrous oxide, which when we make agricultural and fossil fuels, we quite often produce this as well. Some direct effects, so these are things that are directly caused by climate change. So in terms of ocean levels rising, temperatures increasing, rainfall changes, and an increase in severe weather. The indirect causes, so generally what the things above then lead to, we have things like drainage systems bursting, habitat destruction, damage to building and transportation, and making it so crops either are not able to grow in an area, or maybe an area has become warmer, so crops that previously couldn't grow there now can. Species conservation. So species conservation is the human effect that can try and increase the number of a particular organism in an area. So with our effects, cutting down trees, destroying habitats, all these kind of things, we can sometimes negatively affect organisms. We can maybe hunt them to extinction or destroy their natural habitats. To try and reverse these things, we can do breeding programs, we can do conservation, we can stop poaching, we can do habitat corridors, we can do lots of other things as well. Generally, when we protect a natural population or an area, it allows them to recover. So you'll have done the conservation island task in your booklet, and it has you think about what factors you considered when saving different areas. This is just to embed the difficulties around conservation. Feeding the world, we're almost there. So some foods you've eaten in the last 24 hours, this is just to have you think about what foods you eat and how they're affected by the natural food chains. We rely a lot on what are called intensive farming practices. So we use fertilizers to make plants grow really, really well in an area. So it might be that a corn plant would normally produce enough corn for maybe a handful of cereal, but now it produces an entire box. So giving them more of what they need to produce crops allows them to grow better and allows us to get more food. Pesticides stop pests damaging crops. It stops crop loss. We can also use things like herbicides as well, so we can kill weeds, which take up the nutrients from the soil and stop our crops having enough space. Again, this is an experiment you might have done in class, looking at different fertilizers and how they affect the growth of your plants. The main things that are in fertilizers are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So I tend to remember green leaf growth, phosphor roots, root growth, and potassium and geranium roughly rhyme. It's not a great one, but so flowers and fruits. These are the lists of the stages in what's called algal blooms. So sometimes when we use fertilizers in an area and then there's a lot of rainfall, the fertilizers can end up in groundwater, rivers, and lakes. This causes what is supposed to happen, which is it causes plants to grow, because that's what fertilizers do. Unfortunately, microscopic plant-like things, algae, grow faster in these water layers and form a layer over the water. The algae block the sun from reaching other water plants and cause them to die. I should say them, not term. Dead plants and animal matter is used as an energy source by bacteria, So this dead stuff is then eaten by bacteria. They use the oxygen from the water to grow in numbers. This kills the other plants and animals that were living in that water. So it's just a bit of a kind of runaway cascade. You put fertilizers on your crop, and 4 or so stages later, all the animals in a nearby lake are dead. This is the nitrogen cycle. It's quite tricky. They actually took this out of National 5 because it was too hard, but it's still in S3 and National 4. So nitrogen is really important for plants and animals to produce proteins. The simple form is plants take what are called nitrates, which are slightly more simple than amino acids from the soil. They absorb these through their roots, through special chemicals, and turn them into amino acids, which they turn into proteins. Animals then get their amino acids by eating the proteins from plants and from other animals. When any living thing dies, or when it excretes its waste through feces and urine, bacteria and fungi in the soil will break it down into what ammonium compounds or into nitrites, and these are then nitrified by nitrifying bacteria in a process called nitrification into nitrates. So you can see this little part of the cycle here is quite simple. Nitrates taken up, when things die, decomposition happens, and we end up back with nitrates because of the bacteria in the soil. The planet is really, really good at cycling stuff around, and as long as we don't interrupt it, it sorts most things. Sometimes nitrates are not absorbed, they are denitrified, which I always think is a massive shame. They're converted back to nitrogen gas in the air, which is very difficult for living organisms to use. Luckily, things that are called legumes and nitrifying bacteria are sometimes able to turn that back into nitrates in the soil. And also lightning, because of how powerful and sciencey it is, it's able to turn nitrogen into nitrates as well. So nitrogen fixing bacteria, as well as lightning, can turn this back into nitrates. The key part is this cycle here. The nitrates, the amino acids, the decomposition, and back to the nitrates. So that is the end of the booklet. Thank you for staying with me. I know it's over 20 minutes. It's important to, once you look at that, go down this and think, can I do all the things I'm supposed to be able to do? If you've got any problems, please ask your teacher for help.